Chapter 1. The Impossible Crime. It was on a raw and wind-battered evening in late March when the case first touched our lips, a night so bitter that even the smoke from the Baker Street chimneys clung close to the rooftops. Reluctant to rise into the cold, I had just returned from my rounds and was warming my hands by the fire when the bell rang below. Moments later, Mrs. Hudson ushered into our sitting room a gentleman whose aspect suggested at once both authority and distress. He was tall and spare, with the careful bearing of one accustomed to command. Yet his face bore the unmistakable pallor of a man whose nerves had been tested beyond endurance. His eyes darted about the room as though they feared to meet mine, but when they fell upon Holmes, they fixed with a sudden intensity, as though here, at last, stood the one man who might make sense of his ordeal. "You have been in receipt of a message today, Colonel Mordaunt," said Holmes, by way of greeting, before the man had even spoken a word. "It was delivered not by the post, but slipped beneath your door in the early hours." The handwriting was crude, deliberately sewn the contents. Holmes' eyes narrowed fractionally. "Were enough to bring you across the city without delay." The colonel's astonishment was palpable. "Good heavens, sir, how could you possibly—" "Your boots, Colonel. The damp clay is of a kind found only along the river path at Lambeth, near your residence. The right sole bears the faint smudge of a newsprint scrap, transferred from an early edition that must have lined your hallway as it does each morning. But the paper's position near the jamb rather than the center suggests it was nudged aside when you stooped for something laying upon the threshold." Holmes gestured towards the armchair, his manner as brisk as the crackle of the fire. "Now, if you would oblige us with the particulars, I believe we may proceed from the general to the specific." Colonel Mordaunt seated himself, removed his gloves with slow deliberation, and drew a steadying breath. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, my wife, Eleanor, is dead. Found in her own music room, the door locked from the inside. She had been practicing, or so it appeared, for her harp still stood near the open window, though the weather was inhospitable. But the oddest thing, the thing that has driven me here, is this: the servants swear they heard her speaking not an hour before she was found, and one swears she was singing. Not any song, mind you, but my name. And yet, she was gone, Mr. Holmes, quite cold." Holmes' gaze sharpened. "Singing your name, Colonel?" "Yes, sir." A soft, almost lilting refrain. "Henry the nursemaid, says it was. But no one else was in the room, and the doctor is clear. She had been dead for several hours by then." There was a silence broken only by the ticking of the mantel clock. Even I, with my medical training, felt a chill along my spine. "Locked room?" Holmes asked at last. "Securely so. The key still inside the lock, the windows fastened. No mark of forced entry anywhere. And this note you received?" The colonel drew from his pocket a crumpled slip of paper and handed it across. The letters were uneven, almost childlike, yet there was an odd precision to the spacing. "You will hear her again." Holmes read it twice, his fingers tapping a slow rhythm against the arm of his chair. Then, without comment, he rose, fetched his coat, and nodded towards me. "Watson, we dine later. For now, the scene awaits us. Colonel, you will accompany us back to Lambethby, for the voice sings again." The words, calm though they were, seemed to hang in the air like the last note of a dirge. And so began the case of the voice that sang her name. Chapter 2. The case introduction. The hansom jolted along the wet streets, the gas lamps throwing long streaks of gold upon the puddles as we made our way toward Lambeth. Holmes sat opposite me, his chin sunk into the folds of his coat, his eyes half closed in that curious state between rest and alertness, which I had come to recognize as the prelude to deep concentration. The Colonel, wedged beside me, shifted uneasily, his gloved hands clasped together so tightly that the knuckles showed white. I refrained from speaking, for Holmes' silence was purposeful, and I knew that his mind was already turning over the strange combination of elements, the locked room, the singing voice, the impossible time of death, when at last we rattled over the bridge and the wind carried with it the bitter temps of the river. Holmes stirred. "Colonel Mordaunt," he said in his even, almost conversational tone, "you have told us what you saw and heard. What I now require is a picture clear and without embellishment of your wife's habits, the nature of her music, and the precise layout of the music room." The Colonel, grateful perhaps for the chance to speak, began to sketch the outlines of his life at Mordaunt House. Eleanor, he told us, was of a delicate constitution, preferring the quiet company of her harp and her books to society engagements. The music room was her sanctuary, positioned on the second floor, with a single door to the landing and 2 windows overlooking the garden. She would often practice into the night, though the March chill made her tendency to keep the windows ajar a constant cause for marital disagreement. Holmes listened without interruption, but when the Colonel faltered, he prompted him with questions that were as sharp as they were seemingly trivial. How often did she receive visitors? Who knew of her habit of leaving the windows open? Had any items been taken from the room in recent months? The Colonel answered as best he could, but more than once I saw him glance at Holmes with the faintest trace of puzzlement, as though unable to divine the point of such inquiries at one moment. As our cab lurched to avoid a dray, Holmes' eyes slid to the Colonel's left cuff. "You have torn the stitching there recently, I think," he remarked. The Colonel looked down in surprise. "This afternoon, while reaching for a box on the wardrobe's top shelf, the same box in which," he broke off suddenly, his lips compressing into a thin line. "In which what?" Holmes asked, his voice mild but edged with an unspoken insistence. "In which my wife kept her sheet music," the Colonel admitted. "She was particular about its order and arrangement. I thought to tidy it before you came, but found it already disturbed." Holmes' fingers began their familiar steeple formation. "Disturbed how?" "Several pieces missing. 2, I believe. One of them was a composition she wrote herself, a rather haunting melody without lyrics. The other was, well, a folk song she had learned as a girl. I cannot recall the title." We drove on in thoughtful silence. I confess my own mind was already attempting to fit this with the earlier detail of the voice calling the Colonel's name. If she had been singing a song, perhaps one she loved from childhood, might some strange trick of memory, grief, and the servants' imaginations have made it seem she called to him. Yet the medical fact that she had been dead for hours would not be banished so easily. Holmes broke into my reverie. "Watson, you recall the matter of the bishop's letter," he said suddenly. I looked up, startled at the mention of an old case. That, too, presented the illusion of a voice heard beyond its proper time. The difference here is that we have no mere illusion. We have witnesses and a physical impossibility. Both must be true, or both must be false. Our work will be to determine which. The cab at last drew up before Mordaunt House, its tall facade rising pale and stern against the darkness. A constable stood at the gate, stamping his feet against the cold, and admitted us at the colonel's word. Inside, the air was heavy with the scent of extinguished fire, and some lingering sweetness, perhaps a trace of flowers, perhaps something else entirely. I saw Holmes lift his head and inhale, his nostrils flaring almost imperceptibly before we were shown upstairs. As we ascended, Holmes murmured low enough for my ear alone, "Do not look for the obvious in this, Watson. The locked door is a distraction, the singing a veil. What we are to find here will be neither visible nor audible in the way our senses expect." The music room awaited us at the end of the passage, its door now unlatched. Holmes paused upon the threshold, letting his gaze sweep the chamber before stepping inside. I knew then that we had crossed into the heart of the matter, and that from this moment each detail, each misplaced object, each shadow would be recorded in that infallible mind, to be recalled when the time came to reveal the truth. And though I could not have said why, I felt certain that whatever had claimed the life of Eleanor Mordaunt had not yet finished its work. Chapter 3. The First Clues. The music room was a curious mixture of refinement and disquiet. The tall windows stood closed now, their heavy curtains drawn back to admit the pale glow of a street lamp beyond the garden wall. The harp dominated the center of the room, its polished frame gleaming faintly, though a fine film of dust upon the pedals suggested it had not been touched since the tragedy. A low fire smoldered in the grate, and beside it stood an armchair upholstered in pale green, the seat indented as though someone had risen from it only moments before. My gaze was drawn immediately to the far wall, where an open cabinet displayed a neat row of music, scores neat, that is, save for one section where an uneven gap betrayed the absence of several volumes. Holmes moved with his usual quiet precision, his eyes roving not only over the furniture but over the air itself, as though searching for the lingering shadow of what had occurred. He paused first by the harp, running a fingertip along the strings with a soft, almost inaudible hum. The note rang true, but he tilted his head, listening beyond the sound, as if measuring the room's response. "Watson," he murmured, "notice how the resonance is dulled. This instrument has been shifted very slightly from its original position." I could see no difference myself, but Holmes indicated a faint scuff mark upon the carpet, showing where the legs had rested previously at the writing desk. He examined a small blotter and a scattering of quill pens. "She wrote here recently," he said, holding the blotter to the light and revealing faint mirrored impressions of words. I could make out only fragments: garden, night, and what might have been call. He laid it aside without comment, moving on to the hearth, where a small quantity of ash lay upon the fender. Holmes pinched a trace between his fingers and brought it to his nose. "Not paper ash," he observed quietly. "More fibrous perhaps, parchment or vellum. And it has a faint temp. Wax, I believe." Colonel Mordaunt, who had been standing stiffly near the door, shifted uncomfortably. "My wife kept no such materials here, Mr. Holmes." Holmes gave him a sidelong glance, but did not answer directly. Instead, he crossed to the windows. Their brass latches were secure, yet Holmes examined the woodwork minutely, pausing at a section where the paint seemed slightly blistered. "Condensation," he said softly, "and from inside the pane." While Holmes continued his methodical circuit, I took the opportunity to examine the only overt sign of disorder, a small table near the wall, upon which stood a water carafe and a glass. The glass was half filled, but the water was cloudy, as though something had been mixed with it. I mentioned this to Holmes, who came at once to inspect it. He sniffed delicately, then took a clean glass from the cabinet, poured a little of the cloudy liquid, and swirled it beneath his nose. "Almonds," he said, his voice almost inaudible. I started, for that distinctive scent is known to any physician and indicator, in certain contexts, of prussic acid. Holmes set the glass aside without further comment, but his eyes gleamed with the light of some emerging connection. "Watson, do you note the peculiar arrangement of these objects?" He gestured toward the room's center. The harp slightly moved, the chair angled not toward the fire but toward the window. The music cabinet gapped, the glass half drunk and left within reach of the right hand. All this suggests that her last moments here were not spent alone in idle practice. Colonel Mordaunt's face had tightened visibly, and I thought it best to divert the line of discussion until Holmes was ready to speak plainly. I asked whether the servants had been questioned again since the discovery. "They have given their accounts a dozen times," the colonel replied, "and all agree on 2 points. They heard her voice, and they found the door locked from within." Holmes looked up sharply. "The voice, describe it again." The colonel hesitated. "Gentle, almost musical." "She was." "Well, she was singing my name." Holmes' eyes narrowed slightly. "And you are certain that it was hers?" The question seemed almost insulting, yet Holmes delivered it in such an even tone that the colonel could not take offense. "Yes, I am certain." Holmes said nothing further, but I noticed his gaze drift toward the empty space in the music cabinet and then toward the scuffed carpet beneath the harp. He seemed to be fitting together invisible pieces, and the faint tapping of his fingers against his thigh told me that a part of the picture was beginning to form in his mind. At last he crossed to the door. "Watson, the lock, if you please." I knelt to examine it, finding the key still in place on the inside. "A simple mechanism," I reported. "No sign of tampering." Holmes crouched beside me, studying the key with an almost exaggerated slowness. "Observe what's in the position of the teeth in relation to the ward. When the door was found, the key was turned fully. Yet the wards show marks as though the key had been withdrawn and reinserted." "You mean someone locked the door from the outside?" I asked. "Or from the inside without being inside," Holmes replied, straightening. He gave no further explanation, but the spark in his eyes told me that the concept, improbable though it sounded, was already plausible to him. We left the music room presently, Holmes casting one last glance over his shoulder before stepping into the passage. "There is more to be learned here, Watson, but not tonight. The scene has given me the melody tomorrow. We must seek the words." As we descended the stairs, the quiet of the house seemed deeper than before, and I could not rid myself of the feeling that the air still held a faint, ghostly echo of a voice soft and calling a name into the dark. Chapter 4: The Gathering of Suspects. took our leave of the music room with the Colonel's reluctant consent, and Holmes asked to see the household assembled before we departed. It was nearly 10 o'clock by then. Yet, within minutes, the drawing-room held a small company whose varied expressions were as telling, to my mind, as any physical clue. The servants came first. Mrs. Hargreaves, the housekeeper, a woman of stout figure and sharper eye. Martha, the young nursemaid, whose trembling hands betrayed her nerves, and a wiry man named Briggs, the butler, whose narrow features seemed carved into a permanent mask of reserve. Standing apart, and very much not of the servant class, was a dark-haired gentleman of about 30, well-dressed and faintly disdainful, whom the Colonel introduced as Mr. Adrian Lee. His wife's cousin, Holmes, seated himself with the air of one who intends to listen far more than speak, allowing the Colonel to outline for our benefit the position of each person on the evening in question. Mrs. Hargreaves had been in the kitchen, preparing a late tray for her mistress. Briggs had been in the cellar, taking inventory. Martha had been in the nursery, but claimed to have paused on the landing when she heard the voice, Mr. Lee. It appeared, had been in the library on the ground floor, engaged in private correspondence, a phrase he delivered with such clipped emphasis that it seemed designed to cut off inquiry. Holmes' questions, when they came, were deceptively mild. To Mrs. Hargreaves, had the late Mrs. Mordaunt any visitors that day? A pause, then a careful, not to my knowledge, sir. To Briggs, who last brought in the coal for the music room, a muttered, I did, sir, the afternoon before. And to Martha, you say you heard your mistress singing, was it loud enough to carry to the landing? The girl nodded, her eyes wide. Yes, sir, clear as anything. She called the Colonel's name, Weiss. Then all was quiet. It was to Mr. Lee, however, that Holmes devoted the longest scrutiny. I understand you were close to your cousin, he asked. Lee's dark eyes flickered. As close as any family, he replied, though the dryness of his tone suggested otherwise. Holmes regarded him a moment longer before changing tack entirely, inquiring instead about the arrangement of the garden beyond the music-room windows. Lee seemed faintly surprised by the shift, but answered readily enough, describing the narrow path that led toward a locked gate in the high wall. While Holmes drew out these accounts, I contented myself with observation. Mrs. Hargreaves kept her hands folded tightly, as if to prevent herself from speaking too much. Briggs stood rigidly, his eyes darting from speaker to speaker in a manner that suggested he weighed every word for danger. Martha, poor child, looked near tears whenever the locked door was mentioned. As for Mr. Lee, there was a restless energy about him, a faint but constant movement of the fingers as they brushed at his cuff or smoothed his already immaculate hair. Holmes concluded with a general question about the household's recent weeks. Had there been any unusual occurrences, any disturbances? Mrs. Hargreaves ventured that a set of keys had gone missing from the butler's pantry some days prior, but Briggs quickly interjected that they had been found again in the scullery. Holmes made no remark, though I saw him note it down in his mental ledger. At last, with the Colonel's permission, Holmes dismissed them all, and they departed in a shuffle of skirts and measured steps. Once the room was empty, he turned to the Colonel. Your cousin resides here permanently. Temporarily, the Colonel corrected, until his affairs are settled. My wife invited him. She was fond of him, though I confess I have never fully understood why. Holmes merely inclined his head, then moved to the mantel and examined a row of framed photographs. His hand paused over one depicting Mrs. Mordaunt at the harp, her face turned slightly toward the camera. "Curious," he murmured, "how the eyes follow one, even in stillness." He replaced the frame gently, then announced that we had taken up enough of the Colonel's time for one night. As we made our way down the dim hall, Holmes' pace slowed near the staircase. He glanced back toward the drawing-room door, then to me. "A household is like an orchestra, Watson. Each instrument has its place, its sound. When one plays out of time, the whole is thrown into discord. Tonight, I have heard several such notes." We stepped out into the cold, the gate closing behind us with a hollow clang. The cab Holmes had ordered was waiting, and we climbed in without further speech. Yet, as we rattled away from Lambeth, I could see that my friend's eyes were alive with that singular brightness which told me he had not only gathered his suspects, but had already begun to place them within the intricate pattern of the crime. The music, so to speak, had begun. Chapter 5. First suspects, the red herring. The following morning broke clear but cold, the sort of crisp London day that lent a deceptive brightness to the soot-blackened streets. I found Holmes already at the breakfast table when I descended, a copy of the morning edition spread beside his coffee. He did not look up at once, but his long forefinger traced a column with deliberate care. When he spoke, it was with that dry note I knew well a signal that he had been apprised of developments in our case from a quarter other than its principal actors. "It seems, Watson, that Scotland Yard has been industrious overnight," he said, pushing the paper toward me. The headline was brief but pointed. "Arrest expected in Lambeth mystery." The article, scant on detail, hinted that the authorities had identified a person of interest, one connected with the household of Colonel Mordaunt, whom they believed to be in possession of information crucial to the matter. "Do they mean Lee?" I asked, recalling the cousin's restless demeanor. Holmes shook his head faintly. "Not at all. The Yard's attentions have settled upon the butler, Briggs. Our friend Inspector Lestrade has taken the view that the missing sheet music, the disturbed cabinet, and the glass of tainted water point to an attempted theft gone awry, in which Briggs, having been surprised by his mistress, sought to silence her. The case is, you will observe, nicely tied with the string of opportunity and proximity." "But you do not agree," I ventured. "My dear fellow," Holmes replied, spreading butter upon a slice of toast with more energy than culinary necessity required, "if a man seeks to poison another, he does not do so at the very hour when the entire household may come and go. Nor does he arrange matters to produce a Lockstrom puzzle, merely to incriminate himself. It is too elaborate by half. I suspect Briggs is guilty only of some lesser mischief, which the true culprit has been happy to exploit." By mid-morning we were in Lestrade's office at the Yard, where the inspector greeted us with a look of satisfaction not untinged with challenge. "You're just in time, Mr. Holmes. We'll have him in the dock before the week's out. Servant gone bad, always the same story." He produced a small parcel, unwrapping it to reveal 2 folded sheets of music, one in Mrs. Mordaunt's delicate hand, the other, older and more worn. "Found these under a loose board in Briggs's quarters," Lestrade declared. "Says he never saw them before, but I'm not fool enough to believe that." Holmes took them without comment, examining the pages minutely. The first was indeed a composition in Mrs. Morden's script, a melancholy air written in an unusual key. The second bore the title The Calling Song, its staves marked with a simple, repetitive motif. I noticed Holmes' eyes narrow as he turned the second sheet toward the light. "Interesting," he murmured. "These notes would fall on a harp, into a range that—" "Yes, quite. And you say you found them in his room?" "That's right," Lestrade said, clearly impatient for Holmes' approval. Holmes returned the sheets carefully to their wrapping. "I should like to hear from Briggs directly," he said at last. The butler was brought in, pale but composed. He denied all knowledge of the music, insisting he had never entered the music cabinet in his life, save to dust it. His account of the evening before the death was the same as given in the drawing-room, down to the moment he was summoned to help force the door. Holmes questioned him gently, but at length, drawing from him the admission that he had, some days prior, been reprimanded by Mrs. Hargreaves for neglecting his cellar duties, an altercation which, in Lestrade's eyes, was motive enough. Lestrade leaned back with a smile of triumph. "You see, Mr. Holmes, bad blood in the house, missing property, and now the goods found under his floor. It's as plain as day." "Plain," Holmes agreed mildly, "but so is a painted backdrop on a stage, and equally unconvincing when examined from the wings." Outside in the cold air once more, I pressed him for an explanation. "Watson," he said, "the planting of those sheets is as clumsy as it is deliberate. Briggs is a useful distraction, someone the yard can fix upon while the real player arranges the next move. Note particularly the older piece, The Calling Song. I suspect it is no mere relic of Mrs. Morden's youth, but a key possibly quite literally to the sequence of events in that locked room." He would say no more. But as we returned to Baker Street, I could not shake the feeling that the game was moving rapidly toward some hidden turning point, one which would either sweep away Lestrade's neat theory or confirm it utterly. For the moment, Holmes seemed content to let the butler bear the brunt of suspicion, but I knew enough of his methods to see that his real quarry lay elsewhere, someone still within the walls of Mordaunt House, watching the investigation unfold with quiet and dangerous interest. Chapter 6. The Secret Clue. A Hidden Inconsistency. Returned to Baker Street with an energy that belied the steady chill of the March evening. He set his hat upon the stand with an impatient flourish, cast aside his coat, and settled into his favorite armchair by the fire. I found him already sifting through his notes and the bundle of music sheets we had retrieved from Briggs's quarters. "Watson," he began abruptly, "there is an inconsistency here which Lestrade has overlooked, one that casts a long shadow over the whole affair." I leaned forward eagerly, for this case had already begun to unravel the usual certainties of our work. "You recall the testimony of Martha, the nursemaid. She insists she heard Mrs. Mordaunt's voice singing, indeed shortly before the body was discovered. Yet the medical evidence, as well as the statements of the attending physician, affirm that the lady had been dead for some hours before that." "Yes," I said, "the impossibility of a voice from beyond the grave." Holmes nodded. "Yet it is not the impossibility itself that intrigues me, but rather the detail that the servants recall the voice with perfect clarity. A voice singing the Colonel's name, Henry, Henry, not a song or a melody, but a direct call. Now, Consider the sheet music found in Briggs's room, the older composition entitled The Calling Song. He paused to extract the sheet from the bundle, holding it beneath the flickering gaslight. Listen to this, Watson. It is a simple air, repeated with little variation. The title suggests an invocation, a summoning. But what if the voice the servants heard was not a ghostly lament, but a cleverly staged performance? I frowned. A performance? You mean the murder was staged to include a false voice? Precisely. Holmes's eyes gleamed with that familiar spark, and the glass of water tainted with prussic acid, the faint scent of almonds, was meant as a weapon, or perhaps a signal. I looked at him in disbelief. But why would the killer go to such lengths to create an illusion of a voice, to plant false evidence, to mislead, Watson, to divert the yard, and to buy time? Holmes reached for a map of Mordaunt House's immediate environs, spreading it across the table. Now, consider the garden beyond the music room. The narrow path leads to a locked gate, locked, yes, but vulnerable. There is a small outbuilding nearby, and I suspect a person could access the garden unseen from there. My brow furrowed. You think the killer entered or exited through the garden, then? Holmes nodded slowly. But here lies the inconsistency. The servants' accounts, while consistent in some respects, differ on key details. Mrs. Hargreaves claims the windows were closed before dusk. Martha insists they were left open, the night air chilling her mistress. And yet the rain last night would have made an open window unlikely. He tapped the map. The paint blistering on the window frame suggests recent exposure to moisture, but from the inside, not the outside. Someone opened or closed the windows after the fact. The implications were clear. The crime scene had been altered, tampered with. The locked room was a ruse. The true entry and exit points lay elsewhere, obscured beneath layers of deception. Holmes stood abruptly, pacing the length of the room with his long strides. I shall pay another visit to Mordaunt House before dawn. There are voices to be heard, voices not of the dead, but of those very much alive. He paused at the door, glancing back with a knowing smile. You will find, Watson, that in the art of deception, the smallest inconsistency is the thread that unravels the entire tapestry. As he left, I could not help but wonder what new truths awaited us at the threshold of that eerie house, and how many more shadows would dance before the dawn. The fog had not yet lifted when Holmes roused me from a restless sleep, his manner brisk and charged with a rare urgency. We made our way back to Mordaunt House in the dim morning light, the streets slick with the residue of an early drizzle that blurred the gas lamps into halos of trembling amber. Holmes was silent, his mind evidently occupied, but the steady tap of his cane on the cobblestones seemed to mark out the cadence of a thought process unfolding with relentless precision. Upon our arrival, the household greeted us with a mixture of relief and apprehension. Mrs. Hargreaves, the housekeeper, had returned from a late watch, her countenance marked by sleepless anxiety. Martha, the nursemaid, appeared pale and drawn, her eyes wide and haunted. Even the colonel seemed subdued, the burden of grief etched deeply into the lines of his face. Holmes wasted no time. He sought out the familiar confines of the music room, his gaze sharp as a hawk's as he began his meticulous inspection anew. But it was not the room itself that occupied his attention this morning. It was the subtle contradictions in the testimonies of those who had witnessed the final moments of Eleanor Mordaunt's life. Watson, Holmes said quietly, the foundation upon which this entire mystery rests is a paradoxical clash between physical evidence and human perception. The servants swear to have heard Mrs. Mordaunt's voice, soft and clear, singing the Colonel's name not long before her body was found. Yet the medical report is unequivocal. She had been dead for hours by that time. I nodded, recalling the eerie accounts I had heard. A ghostly voice, then, or some trick of the mind? Holmes shook his head slowly. Not a ghost, my dear Watson. There is no room for the supernatural in our investigations. The truth is often stranger, more cunning. He drew from his coat a folded piece of the morning's newspaper, the edges softened by damp. Consider the morning edition, left where it fell, near the threshold of the music room. The smudge on the Colonel's boot sole matches the print perfectly, no question there. But the paper's position, pushed to the side, suggests recent disturbance. Someone has been in that threshold after the paper was placed. Holmes' eyes gleamed as he turned to the windows, now freshly closed against the morning chill. Notice the paint on this frame, he said, running a finger gently along the edge. Blistered and damp, but from condensation on the inside. This indicates that the window was opened after the rain, not before. My brow furrowed. But the servants say the windows were open during her final hours. Holmes' gaze sharpened, and therein lies the inconsistency. The scene has been altered, Watson. Someone has tampered with the evidence to mislead the investigation. He paused, then produced a small vial from his pocket, the remnants of a faint scent lingering within. The water glass, found half consumed and left on the table, carries the unmistakable aroma of bitter almanza, sure sign of prussic acid. The poison was administered here, not through violent means, but with subtlety. Holmes' fingers traced the outline of the glass on the tablecloth, where a faint, wet mark stained the fabric. The placement of the glass, the angle of the chair, and the shifted harp all suggest a last moment of struggle or, perhaps, a final act of concealment. As he spoke, the servants gathered nearby exchanged nervous glances. Mrs. Hargreaves, steadfast but visibly shaken, murmured, "I only wished to protect the family, Mr. Holmes." Holmes gave her a compassionate but firm look. Protection built on lies is a fragile shield, Mrs. Hargreaves. The truth must be allowed to breathe. Turning to me, he said, "Watson, the narrative woven by the household is incomplete." The voice heard by Martha, the singing of Henry, was no mere coincidence. It was a calculated performance, designed to confuse and delay discovery. He stood abruptly, moving to the window to peer out at the bleak garden beyond. The garden path leads to a locked gate, yes, but it is not the only route. There is a small outbuilding nearby, overlooked by most. I suspect it served as a clandestine passage, ingress and egress for the true culprit. Holmes' mind raced as he pieced together the scattered clues to missing sheet music, the disturbed threshold, the altered window frame. The crime scene is a stage, he mused aloud, and every detail has been choreographed to mislead the players. He faced me with a steady gaze. Tomorrow we shall revisit the house at dawn. There are voices to be heard, voices of the living, burdened by secrets and fears. It is in their hesitations and half-spoken words that the final truth awaits. The chill of the early morning seeped through the window panes as Holmes returned to his chair, his fingers steepled once more. In the art of detection, Watson, the smallest inconsistency is the thread that unravels the entire fabric of deception. As I settled beside him, I could not shake the sensation that the house, silent yet watchful, held its breath alongside us, waiting for the moment when the final curtain would fall on this haunting tragedy. Chapter 7. The crime grows stranger before dawn. The city wore a muted stillness, the fog curling like smoke through the alleys and casting long shadows over the sleeping rooftops. Holmes had insisted upon an early return to Mordaunt House, and as we approached, the garden gate stood slightly ajar, a detail I might have missed if not for Holmes' keen gaze. The narrow path beyond was slick with dew, and the faint traces of footsteps led from the gate toward the outbuilding he had mentioned. Inside the house, the atmosphere felt charged, tense, as though the walls themselves held their breath. Mrs. Hargreaves greeted us with a wary glance, but Holmes' calm manner seemed to reassure her. "I trust the night was restful?" he asked quietly. She nodded but said nothing. Holmes began by retracing the route through the music room, inspecting the windows and the floor with deliberate care. "You were right, Watson," he said, without looking up. "The windows were indeed opened after the death, not before. The moisture inside the frame is fresh, far too recent to be explained by the previous night's weather," I noted. "Too, that the carpet near the windows bore faint scratches, as if some object had been dragged in or out with difficulty. But it was as we moved toward the outbuilding that the day's oddness deepened. The door was unlocked, creaking open to reveal a cramped, cluttered space filled with garden tools and a scattering of broken pots. Yet there, beneath a loose floorboard, lay a small bundle wrapped in faded cloth. Holmes unwrapped it carefully, revealing a collection of letters tied with a crimson ribbon, their edges worn with age. "These," Holmes said softly, "may explain more than any witness's testimony." I glanced over the pages, noting the flowing script and the frequent repetition of a single name. The letters spoke of a secret past, of fears and threats made in shadowed rooms, of a trust betrayed. One letter, dated nearly a year prior, hinted at an unnamed figure who had sworn vengeance against the colonel's wife. As we absorbed this revelation, a sudden commotion stirred in the garden. The nursemaid, Martha, appeared at the door, pale and breathless. "There's been an accident," she stammered. "Mr. Lee, he's fallen at the gate." We hurried outside to find the young man lying sprawled at the foot of the garden wall, a faint trickle of blood staining his temple. His eyes fluttered open, confusion clouding them. I was just going to check the lock," he murmured. "Thought I heard someone moving." Holmes knelt beside him, examining the wound with practiced care. "A deliberate push, Watson," he said grimly, "though from whom and for what purpose remains unclear." The household's calm facade was cracking. What had once seemed a simple, if baffling, death was now becoming a web of threats, fears, and near violence. Even the suspects appeared less like mere players on a stage and more like prisoners, caught in a tightening snare. As we helped Mr. Lee inside to recover, Holmes' eyes never ceased their sharp, searching movements. "This case," he said quietly, "is far stranger than any of us imagined, and its true nature is only just beginning to unfold. In the days to come, I knew the threads of mystery would entangle us still further, drawing us inexorably toward a truth both astonishing and terrible. For now, the voice that sang Eleanor's name seemed less like a haunting lament and more like a challenge, a summons from the shadows of a past not yet laid to rest, before dawn had fully broken. The city lay wrapped in a soft, gray mist, its streets silent, save for the distant echoes of the early risers. Holmes insisted we return to Mordaunt House while the world still slumbered, his intuition urging him to seize the fragile threads of evidence before they could be lost in the bustle of day. The garden gate stood ajar, a subtle but telling sign that all was not as it seemed. The narrow gravel path beyond was damp with dew and bore the faint imprint of hurried footsteps, some leading into the fog, others returning, but none clear enough to reveal their bearer's identity. The air carried a faint chill, mingling with the scent of wet earth and dying blooms, a fragrance both familiar and uncanny. Within the house, the atmosphere had shifted palpably. The heavy curtains hung still. The silence was charged, as though the very walls awaited revelation. Mrs. Hargreaves met us at the door, her usual composure shaken, lips pressed thin, eyes darting with suppressed fear. Martha, the nursemaid, appeared frail and trembling, her presence a silent testament to courage born of desperation. Even Colonel Mordaunt's stern demeanor softened under the weight of recent events. Holmes wasted no time retracing his steps to the music room, where every object, every shadow, seemed a potential whisper of the truth. The windows, freshly closed against the dawn, bore traces of moisture on their inner frames-proof. Holmes declared that they had been opened after Eleanor's death. The slight scratches on the carpet near the harp suggested more than simple disturbance. They hinted at a struggle, a hurried departure, but it was the discovery in the garden outbuilding that truly deepened the mystery. The door, slightly ajar and smelling faintly of smoke, revealed a cramped space cluttered with tools and forgotten implements. Beneath a loose floorboard lay a bundle of yellowed letters, tied with a crimson ribbon, fragile threads of a past long concealed. Holmes unfolded the letters with reverence, his keen eyes scanning the flowing script. They told of threats whispered in shadowed rooms, of broken promises and a looming vengeance. One letter, penned nearly a year before, spoke of a figure named Gerald Crane, whose name had been murmured in hushed tones but never fully confronted. As we absorbed these revelations, a sudden commotion in the garden drew us outside. Martha appeared, her face pale and drawn, breathless with alarm. "Mr. Lee has fallen," she cried. "He stumbled near the gate. There's blood." We hurried to the scene, finding Adrian Lee sprawled against the cold stone wall, a trickle of crimson marking his temple. His eyes fluttered open, confusion clouding their depths. I heard footsteps," he murmured weakly. "Near the garden. Someone was there." Holmes knelt beside him, examining the injury with a practiced hand. "A push, Watson. Not an accident, but an attempt to silence or hinder." The implication was clear. Someone desperate to keep secrets hidden had struck again. The household's fragile calm shattered. What had begun as a perplexing mystery was now a tangled web of threats, betrayals, and near violence. The suspects, once mere players on a stage, now seemed ensnared in a tightening snare, their facades cracking under pressure. That evening, as the house settled under a tense silence, Holmes' gaze never wavered from the flickering flames of the hearth. The case is no longer merely a question of who, but what. The past has risen again to claim its due, and the voice that sang Eleanor's name is no mere ghost, it is a summons. In the days that followed, the threads of this grim tale grew ever more knotted, drawing Holmes, and through him myself, deeper into a labyrinth where shadows held sway and truth was a treasure fiercely guarded. The melody of a voice, once soft and haunting, now sounded like a battle cry demanding justice, retribution, and the unveiling of secrets long buried beneath layers of silence and deceit. Chapter 8. Holmes tests a theory. The morning light filtered weakly through the drawn curtains of Baker Street, casting long shadows across the familiar disorder of Holmes' quarters. Yet there was a renewed purpose in my companion's movements, an intensity in the gleam of his eyes as he prepared for the day ahead. "Watson," he said quietly, "today we shall begin to separate truth from artifice. It is time to engage with our suspects on a more delicate plane." Holmes was referring, of course, to the subtle psychological interplay that so often lay at the heart of his investigations. Mere evidence, no matter how meticulously gathered, was only part of the equation. The human element, the half-spoken word, the flicker of a glance, the momentary hesitation, these were the keys to unlocking the mysteries that logic alone could not fully reveal. Our first visit was to Mrs. Hargreaves, whose manner, the previous night, had been guarded but respectful. Holmes greeted her with a gentle tone, speaking of the strain such events placed upon a household and the burden of loyalty. Yet, as he probed, he introduced slight variations in his questions, subtle contradictions meant to catch any faltering. "Mrs. Hargreaves," he began, "you mentioned last evening that the windows to the music room were closed before dusk, yet Mr. Lee suggested they were open when he returned. Can you clarify this discrepancy?" The housekeeper's eyes flickered, and she pursed her lips. I cannot say for certain. I was busy with the kitchen fires, and did not personally attend to the windows." Holmes' gaze was steady. "And the keys to the garden gate, were they always kept on the same ring?" She hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, sir, but the keys went missing for a time last week, found again in the scullery." Holmes inclined his head slightly. "Thank you, Mrs. Hargreaves. Your candor is appreciated." From there, we proceeded to the nursemaid, Martha. Her trembling hands betrayed her nervousness, and Holmes' approach was gentler, almost paternal. "Martha, when you heard your mistress singing, was it a full song or a single phrase?" The girl swallowed hard. "It was just her name, sir. Henry, Henry," she said it softly, like a lullaby. "And did you see anyone else near the music room at that time?" "No, sir. I was on the landing, but I heard footsteps, soft but coming, from the garden side." Holmes made a note of this, and then turned his attention to the recovering Mr. Lee. Here he employed a different strategy. He spoke in riddles, presented hypothetical scenarios, and watched intently for any sign of discomfort or revelation. "Imagine, Mr. Lee," he said, "that a visitor, unknown to the household, were to gain entrance through the garden gate in the dead of night. What do you suppose their purpose might be?" Lee's dark eyes flickered with unease. "To seek revenge, perhaps, or to uncover secrets better left buried." Holmes smiled thinly. "Secrets, indeed. And what of trust betrayed? Are such shadows familiar to you? Lee's composure cracked for the briefest moment, and Holmes leaned forward slightly, his voice low and steady. You have spoken of private correspondence, yet few here have seen your letters. Might they contain more than mere pleasantries? The young man said nothing, but the tightening of his jaw spoke volumes. As we left Mordaunt House that afternoon, Holmes turned to me with a contemplative expression. The psychological landscape of this case is as treacherous as any physical terrain. Every word spoken, every gesture made, carries weight. Our task is to read these signs as carefully as the print upon a page. I nodded, aware that the path to truth was winding and fraught with uncertainty. Yet, with Holmes' unerring eye and razor intellect, I dared to hope that even the darkest shadows might soon yield their secrets. Unbeknownst to us, however, a pair of eyes watched from a shadowed corner of the street, silent and unblinking, as the detective and his companion vanished from sight. The game, it seemed, had entered a new and more perilous phase. Chapter 9. A second attempt. The culprit strikes again. The night descended swiftly, cloaking London in a velvet darkness that seemed to swallow even the gas lamp's glow. Back at Baker Street, the atmosphere was charged with a tension that weighed upon us both like an unseen presence. Holmes sat by the window, fingers steepled beneath his chin, eyes fixed on the shadowed street below. I, too restless to remain idle, paced the room with the unease of a man who senses the storm is far from spent. It was just past midnight when the sharp knock came at the door, signaled that the events of the day were about to take a darker turn. Lestrade entered without ceremony, breathless and grim-faced, clutching a telegram in one hand and a bundle of papers in the other. His news was grave. There's been an incident at Mordaunt House, he began, voice low. Someone tried to destroy evidence, set fire to a portion of the garden shed, the same outbuilding where you found those letters. The flames were caught early, but the scorch marks and damage are extensive. Worse still, a key witness has vanished. Martha, the nursemaid. Holmes rose at once, a sharp light igniting behind his eyes. The game grows more dangerous, Inspector. Who would risk such desperate measures? Lestrade shrugged. That's what we intend to find out. But it's clear the culprit is aware we are closing in. Without hesitation, Holmes donned his coat and hat, signaling to me that the night's vigil was far from over. At Mordaunt House, the scene was chaotic. Firemen still dousing the last embers, Mrs. Hargreaves weeping softly by the doorway, and the Colonel pacing with a mixture of dread and fury. The outbuilding, once a modest refuge for garden tools, now bore the scars of an attempt to obliterate secrets. Holmes examined the charred remains with a practiced eye, noting the patterns of burn and the areas spared. The arsonist knew exactly what to destroy and what to leave intact, he muttered. Precision, not panic, as the household gathered. The absence of Martha was palpable. Mrs. Hargreaves confessed she had found the nursemaid's bed untouched that evening, her belongings still in place. She must have fled, she whispered. Holmes nodded slowly. Or been taken. The following hours were spent in urgent inquiry. Neighbors reported seeing a figure hurriedly leaving the property earlier that evening, cloaked and hooded. Mr. Lee, too, was restless, offering little but vague assurances that he would assist fully. Yet Holmes' scrutiny of his demeanor suggested a deeper unease. A man caught in a web, not of his own weaving, but unwilling or unable to break free. Later, as the household settled under a tense silence, Holmes and I withdrew to the music room once more. The window stood ajar, and the faint scent of smoke lingered faintly beneath the lingering notes of a long-forgotten melody. Holmes placed the letters we had found back into the secret compartment beneath the floorboard and then turned to me with a grave expression. The second attempt to silence witnesses and destroy evidence confirms one truth: the danger is imminent and personal. Whoever seeks to conceal this secret is willing to risk everything. He paced the room, his mind racing through possibilities. Watson, the shadow that called Eleanor's name, is no longer content with mystery. It has grown into a threat. We must be vigilant. As the candle flickered low, I knew the night's darkness was matched only by the growing depths of the enigma that bound us. The voice that sang her name was no mere echo, but a summons, a call to face a peril that would not be denied. The night that followed the unsettling events at Mordaunt House carried a chill deeper than the mere dropping of temperature. The London fog wove its familiar cloak over the city's restless streets, muffling sound and swallowing light, as if eager to conceal the dark deeds that still lingered beneath the surface. Holmes and I found ourselves once again summoned to the scene of the tragedy. The urgency in Lestrade's voice through the telegram, leaving no doubt that the mystery had taken a perilous turn. Upon arrival, the scene was chaotic. Firemen still fought the last embers of a blaze that had nearly consumed the garden outbuilding, the very place where we had found those revealing letters. The smell of smoke clung stubbornly to the damp air, the blackened wood a grim testament to the arsonist's intent. Mrs. Hargreaves stood near the threshold, tears streaking her pale cheeks, her hands trembling as she recounted the horror. "It was deliberate, sir," she whispered. "Someone tried to burn the evidence, those letters, the secrets, all gone." Holmes knelt amidst the smoldering ruins, his keen eyes tracing the patterns of scorch and shadow. "Notice, Watson, how the fire's reach was careful, deliberate. The killer sought to destroy what threatened them, but knew precisely where to stop, preserving just enough to send a message." Lestrade, his brow furrowed, informed us that the nursemaid, Martha, had vanished without a trace. Her bed was untouched, her possessions undisturbed. It was as if she had fled into the night, pursued or panicked. The implications were chilling. The killer was not merely desperate, but bold, willing to escalate the threat to silence those who might reveal the truth. The household's fragile sense of safety shattered utterly. Reports from neighbors spoke of a cloaked figure slipping swiftly from the estate at dusk. Shadowed and hurried, Mr. Lee appeared visibly shaken, his dark eyes restless and distant. Yet Holmes' scrutiny revealed subtle tells, a quickening heartbeat, a twitch of the fingers, betraying a man caught in a tightening noose. As we withdrew from the garden's charred remains, Holmes confided, "This is no longer a game of cat and mouse, Watson. The stakes have been raised. The killer is aware of our pursuit and will stop at nothing." The voice that once sang a haunting refrain had transformed into a scream, a desperate call echoing through the fog, signaling danger not just to those within Mordaunt House, but to all who sought the truth. That night, as the rain began to fall softly upon the window panes of Baker Street, I found myself staring into the flames, pondering the darkness yet to come. Holmes, ever restless, sat poised for the battles ahead, a sentinel standing guard at the fragile boundary between light and shadow. Chapter 10. The true motive begins to surface. Days following the attempted arson and Martha's sudden disappearance were marked by a pall of unease that settled heavily over Mordaunt House. The household, once a place of quiet routine, now seemed beset by shadows that whispered in every corner. Holmes, however, moved through these disquieting moments with a clarity of purpose that reassured me even as the mystery deepened. It was during a late afternoon visit that Holmes requested a private audience with Colonel Mordaunt. The room where they met was lined with bookshelves and heavy curtains, lending an air of somber intimacy to their exchange. I waited in the adjoining study, the flicker of the fire casting restless shadows as I considered the puzzle before us. When Holmes finally emerged, his face was unusually grave. "Watson," he began, "the surface of this case has been carefully polished to conceal a far darker and more complex truth. We are no longer dealing with a crime of opportunity, but one rooted in years of bitter grievance and clandestine betrayal." He motioned for me to follow and lead me to the garden where the scarred outbuilding stood, a stark reminder of the lengths to which someone would go to bury the past. "The letters we found," Holmes explained, "are correspondence between Mrs. Mordaunt and a figure from her past, a man named Gerald Crane. I recalled hearing the name during our inquiries, mentioned only briefly and dismissed as a distant acquaintance." Holmes continued, "Crane's presence in Eleanor's life was a secret she guarded fiercely. These letters reveal threats, demands, and a terrible ultimatum. It appears that Eleanor had once promised to meet him, but later withdrew, inciting a grudge that has festered unseen until now." We returned inside to confront the colonel, who listened with a stoicism that belied the turmoil beneath. He confessed that Crane had been a suitor in Eleanor's youth, a man of volatile temper and dubious reputation. When the courtship ended, Crane disappeared from public view, only to resurface through these letters, invoking a past best left forgotten. Holmes' mind was already weaving connections. "Consider, Watson, the calling song found in Briggs's quarters. It is no mere coincidence. The melody was a signal between Eleanor and Crane, a secret language known only to them. The singing that summoned Henry was a message, perhaps a cry for help or a warning. But why the staged locked-room scenario?" I asked. "To mislead and to confuse. The true killer sought to obscure the motive, divert suspicion, and buy time." Holmes paused, eyes narrowing, and to silence those who might reveal the truth. As we pieced together this revelation, a knock came at the door. Mrs. Hargreaves entered, bearing a note she had found hidden within the folds of the colonel's coat. The message was brief but chilling. "The past will sing again, and all will be heard." Holmes folded the paper with a sigh. "The game's end draws near, Watson. The shadows lengthen, and the final notes of this grim melody await their cue." The deeper we delved into Eleanor Mordaunt's history, the clearer it became that this was no ordinary crime of passion or chance. Beneath the surface lay secrets of love, betrayal, and vengeance, threads that, once pulled, would unravel the carefully constructed facade and expose the darkness lurking beneath the music's haunting refrain. The morning air was thick with mist as Holmes and I approached Mordaunt House once more, the heavy fog lending a spectral quality to the familiar facade. The grand building loomed before us, its windows like dark, watchful eyes, hiding secrets too long whispered in shadow. The events of the previous night, the fire, the disappearance of Martha, the attempted escape of Adrian Lee, had deepened the mystery, and Holmes moved with the quiet determination of a man who sensed the hour of revelation was near. Inside, the atmosphere was charged with a tension that seemed to ripple through the very walls. Colonel Mordaunt greeted us with a weary nod, the weight of grief and uncertainty plainly visible. Mrs. Hargreaves was distant and pale, while Martha's return from hiding was marked by a fragile but steadfast resolve. Yet all eyes, mine especially, turned to Holmes, knowing his mind was already unraveling the tangled threads. Holmes wasted no time. "Colonel, Mrs. Hargreaves," he began, his tone measured, "we are on the cusp of understanding not only how Eleanor Mordaunt met her end, but why. The motives behind a crime are often hidden in the quietest corners of the past, and it is there we must look." He drew from his coat a bundle of letters, their edges worn and ink faded with time. "These correspondences," he explained, "between Eleanor and a man named Gerald Crane, reveal a history marked by love, betrayal, and threats. Eleanor's efforts to sever ties with Crane ignited a vendetta that would not rest quietly." As Holmes spoke, I saw the lines of pain deepen on the colonel's face. Gerald Crane was a suitor from Eleanor's youth, a man with a volatile temper and shadowed past. When she ended the courtship, he disappeared from public view, only to resurface with dark intent. Holmes continued, "The letters contain veiled warnings, ultimatums, and a chilling demand for a final meeting. Eleanor's fear of this man, and the danger she perceived, was well-founded." Turning to me, Holmes said, "The calling song discovered in Briggs's quarters is no mere relic. It was a secret signal between Eleanor and Crane, a coded melody known only to them. The singing that summoned Henry was that signal, a desperate cry woven into music. But why would Lee seek to murder Eleanor if Crane was the threat?" I asked. Holmes' eyes flickered with intensity. "Lee's motive is layered with jealousy, fear, and misguided protection. He believed he could shield Eleanor from Crane's vengeance, but in doing so, he became the architect of her demise." He laid the letters carefully on the table. Lee's knowledge of Eleanor's past and his access to the household gave him the means to execute a crime of careful deception. The locked room, the poisoned glass, the staged singing, all were elements in a calculated plan. Holmes paused, his gaze distant. "And yet, the true motive goes beyond mere jealousy or fear. It is a dark tapestry of secrets, betrayals, and desperate love threads that, once pulled, unravel the facade and expose the raw human cost." As the gravity of this truth settled, a note was delivered hidden within the folds of the colonel's coat. A final warning: the past will sing again, and all will be heard. Holmes folded the note slowly, the lines of resolve hardening on his face. "We are nearing the end, Watson," he said quietly. "The shadows lengthen, and the final melody awaits its cue." Outside, the fog thickened once more, swirling like the ghosts of the past, while inside, the house held its breath, poised on the brink of revelation. Chapter 11. The the bait Holmes' grand strategy. The hours that followed were filled with a sense of mounting urgency, as Holmes prepared his final gambit with a precision that was almost surgical. He spent the morning at Baker Street, poring over every scrap of evidence and revisiting the letters from Gerald Crane with an intensity that left little room for doubt or distraction. "We must set a trap, Watson," he said quietly as I entered the room. "One designed to draw our culprit from the shadows and into the light." His plan was simple in its cunning and delicate in its execution. We would return to Mordaunt House, but this time Holmes would send a carefully worded message, a forged letter, crafted in the hand of Eleanor herself, inviting Crane to meet in the music room under the guise of reconciliation. The message, Holmes believed, would be impossible for Crane to resist. That afternoon, under the watchful eye of the household, Holmes dispatched the note with Mrs. Hargreaves, instructing her to place it in the outbuilding beneath the loose floorboard, precisely where the previous letters had been discovered. The waiting began each hour, thick with suspense. The household grew restless, and I noted with concern the subtle shifts in the behavior of both Mr. Lee and the Colonel. Lee's dark eyes betrayed a flicker of apprehension whenever the subject of the note was raised, while the Colonel's face was drawn with an exhaustion born of months of torment that evening. As twilight seeped into night, Holmes and I took our places in the music room, concealed behind the heavy curtains. The harp stood silent in the corner, its polished frame gleaming faintly in the lamplight. The air was heavy with anticipation, the faint scent of lavender mingling with the residue of the day's rain. Hours passed with only the distant toll of the city's clocks to mark time. Then a faint sound, a soft footfall in the garden, broke the stillness. Holmes stiffened beside me. A shadow moved past the window, cautious and deliberate. The figure slipped inside through the garden gate, moving with the ease of one familiar with the grounds. Holmes whispered, "Watch closely, Watson." The intruder approached the music room door, glancing nervously over their shoulder before attempting the handle. It was locked, but a small click echoed as the door swung open, revealing the slender form of a woman cloaked in shadow. I recognized her instantly as Martha Thansidis, her eyes wide with fear but resolute. She stepped inside, closing the door softly behind her. Moments later, the door opened again, and a second figure entered, a man whose features were obscured beneath the brim of a dark hat. He moved with purpose, but there was a hesitation in his step that suggested uncertainty. Holmes' breath caught slightly as recognition dawned. This was no stranger, but Gerald Crane himself. The two figures conversed in hushed tones, the weight of their past grievances spilling forth in sharp, bitter words. I strained to catch fragments, a mention of broken promises, threats exchanged, and a final, desperate plea from the nursemaid to spare Eleanor's memory. Suddenly, Crane reached into his coat, producing a small vial. Holmes tensed, and I instinctively reached for my revolver, but the nursemaid's swift intervention was quicker. With a desperate cry, she lunged forward, knocking the vial from his hand. It shattered on the floor, releasing a faint scent of almonds. Holmes stepped forward, his voice firm and commanding. "Enough." The tension snapped like a broken string, and Crane's shoulders sagged as if the weight of years had finally crushed him. As the night deepened, the truth began to emerge, not merely of a crime, but of shattered lives, desperate choices, and the haunting echo of a voice that had sung her name long after the last note had faded. Holmes looked toward me, eyes reflecting the flickering candlelight. "The trap is set, Watson, and now we wait for the final act." The somber light of the waning afternoon filtered through the stained glass of Baker Street, casting fractured hues upon the scattered papers and worn books that littered Holmes' cluttered desk. The events of the past weeks had coalesced into a tapestry of shadow and subtlety, and now, in the quiet of the room, Holmes prepared to set his final, delicate trap. He moved with a purposeful grace, gathering the scattered fragments of evidence letters, music sheets, and notes, each piece a vital thread in the complex weave of deception and secrecy. His eyes sparkled with that familiar intensity, the mind of a man who saw far beyond the surface, who read the silent language hidden between words and gestures. "Watson," he began, "we stand upon the edge of revelation. The true architect of this tragedy remains at large. Yet I am confident that the lure we prepare shall draw them forth." He spoke of a letter crafted in the hand and tone of Eleanor herself, sent as bait to Gerald Crane, inviting him to a final meeting under the guise of reconciliation. The letter was a masterpiece of subtlety, a whispered promise amidst the storm of suspicion, designed to ignite the embers of an obsession too potent to resist. Holmes entrusted Mrs. Hargreaves with its delivery, instructing her to place it beneath the loose floorboard of the guarding outbuilding, the very place where we had uncovered the letters that had revealed so much. Days stretched thin with anxious waiting. The household was restless, the air thick with unspoken fears and barely concealed glances. Mr. Lee, once composed and distant, showed cracks in his facade. The colonel bore his grief in silence, the memory of Eleanor, a shadow that neither time nor truth could fully dispel. At last, twilight settled, wrapping the city in a soft, gray veil. Holmes and I took our places in the music room, concealed behind heavy curtains. The harp stood solemn and untouched, its polished frame catching the last rays of fading light. The room was heavy with anticipation, the faint scent of lavender mingling with the cool air from the slightly ajar window. Hours slipped by in stillness, broken only by the distant tolling of church bells and the occasional rustle of leaves stirred by a gentle breeze. Then, from the garden came the faintest sound, a soft footfall on gravel, cautious and deliberate. Holmes' gaze sharpened, every muscle tensed in readiness. Through the window, a shadow moved, a slender figure cloaked in darkness, slipping through the garden gate with the furtive grace of one well acquainted with these grounds. Holmes whispered, "The trap is sprung." The figure approached the music room door, glancing warily before testing the handle. It yielded with a soft click, revealing the pale form of Martha. Her eyes shone with a mixture of fear and determination as she stepped inside, closing the door behind her. Moments later, a second figure entered, tall, cloaked, the brim of a hat shadowing the features beneath. It was Gerald Crane, drawn like a moth to flame by the carefully crafted invitation. His movements bore both purpose and hesitation, a man caught between obsession and dread within the room. Their voices fell to whispered tones, words laced with bitter memories and desperate pleas. I strained to catch fragments, accusations of betrayal, promises broken, and Martha's impassioned appeal to spare Eleanor's memory Suddenly, Crane produced a small vial, its contents dark and foreboding. Holmes tensed, and I instinctively reached for my revolver. But Martha was quicker. She lunged forward, shattering the vial upon the floor. The faint scent of bitter almonds filled the air, a silent testament to the poison that might have been. Holmes stepped forward, his voice firm and unyielding. Enough. The confrontation shattered the fragile veneer of secrecy, and as Crane's shoulders sagged with the weight of guilt and despair, the truth began to surface, not merely of a crime, but of love twisted into obsession and desperation. Holmes turned to me, eyes reflecting the flickering candlelight. The bait has been laid, Watson. And now we await the final act. The haunting melody that had echoed through these halls, the voice that sang Eleanor's name, was no longer a spectral lament, but the summons to justice, drawing the shadows into the light at last. Chapter 12. The moment of recognition. The morning sun struggled to pierce the heavy London fog as Holmes and I made our way back to Baker Street, our minds still racing from the events of the previous night. The confrontation with Gerald Crane had shattered many assumptions, yet Holmes' face bore that inscrutable expression of a man who had glimpsed only part of the truth. As we settled into the familiar confines of the sitting room, Holmes began to pace, hands clasped behind his back, eyes flickering with the restless flame of thought. "Watson," he said at length, "last night's encounter has provided us with much, but the puzzle remains incomplete. There is a final piece, a subtle clue hidden beneath layers of misdirection, waiting to reveal itself." He pulled from his coat a small scrap of fabric, folded carefully within the lining. I examined it closely, a delicate thread, embroidered with a pattern faintly reminiscent. "Where did you find this?" I asked. Holmes smiled faintly. "In the folds of Mrs. Hargreaves' apron this morning." The revelation gave me pause. The housekeeper, already burdened with grief and fear, had perhaps been closer to the unfolding tragedy than any of us suspected. Holmes' mind was already weaving the connections between the fabric, the stolen letters, and the elusive voice that had haunted the household. "Consider, Watson," Holmes continued, "the singing that called the Colonel's name. It was no ghostly lament, nor a simple accident. It was a carefully crafted signal, a message encoded in music and voice, designed to lure, to confuse, and to conceal." He unfolded a sheet of music, pointing to the repetitive motif. This melody, the calling song, was the key. But the true message lay not in the notes themselves, but in their delivery, the pauses, the emphasis, the very timbre of the voice. It was a code, one known only to those bound by shared history and secrets. I was struck by the elegance of the deduction, yet I sensed Holmes was holding back the full extent of his realization. "Is the code broken, then?" I pressed. Holmes nodded slowly. "Yes, but only just. The missing letters, the staged, locked room, the attempts to silence witnesses, all were part of a grand design to keep this secret buried. Yet it was the smallest thread, this fragment of embroidered cloth, that unraveled it." He paused. "Mrs. Hargreaves, for all her loyalty, carries a burden of guilt. Her silence was purchased with threats, and her hands tremble not from grief alone." As the pieces fell into place, Holmes turned to me with a look both somber and resolute. "Soon, Watson, the full truth will emerge, not merely of a murder, but of a life destroyed by secrets and lies. The voice that sang Eleanor's name was a call for justice, long delayed but not denied. The weight of his words settled between us, a quiet promise that the mystery's heart was close at hand, and that the final revelation, when it came, would resonate far beyond the walls of Mordaunt House. Chapter 13. The Final Attempt to Escape. Days that followed the unraveling of secrets at Mordaunt House were marked by a palpable tension that hung over the household like a gathering storm. Holmes and I returned frequently, our visits punctuated by moments of stillness and sudden insight, yet always shadowed by the knowledge that the true culprit remained at large. Their desperation mounting one evening, as the sun dipped behind the gray clouds and the house settled into the uneasy calm before night, an urgent summons drew us back to Lambeth. The housekeeper met us at the door, her face pale and drawn. "It's Mr. Lee, sir," she said breathlessly. "He's missing. His room found in disarray, and the back gate wide open." Holmes' eyes narrowed. An attempt to flee, or a trap laid for him. We searched the house swiftly, but found no sign of the young man. The garden gate's lock showed no signs of forced entry, but the latch was bent, as though hurriedly manipulated. The narrow path beyond was disturbed footprints leading into the fog, lost to the shadows of the night as dawn broke. A messenger arrived with news from a nearby inn, a stranger matching Lee's description had been seen boarding a coach bound for the northern counties. Holmes wasted no time in organizing a pursuit, and I accompanied him, the urgency of the chase pressing upon us like a living thing. Along the winding roads and through rain-slicked villages, we pressed onward, chasing shadows and half-formed clues. Holmes' mind, ever restless, pieced together fragments of whispered conversations, discarded letters, and a growing web of deceit. When we finally caught up to the coach at a lonely roadside inn, Lee was nowhere to be found. The innkeeper mentioned a hurried departure in the early hours, a man asking for a post to the next town. The driver spoke of a passenger, nervous and glancing frequently over his shoulder. Holmes turned to me, his voice low and sharp. "Our quarry is running, not from the law, but from the past he cannot escape." We returned to London with heavy hearts, the weight of the case pressing ever tighter. Yet, even as the search continued, Holmes remained certain the fugitive's flight was the final, desperate act of a man cornered, his options dwindling. Back at Mordaunt House, the remaining household braced for the coming reckoning. Holmes, meanwhile, prepared for the confrontation that would bring the tangled threads of deceit to a final, inevitable conclusion. "Soon, Watson," he said quietly, "we shall see who answers the last call." The voice that sang Eleanor's name, once a haunting echo, now rang clear as a summons, not just for justice, but for the truth that no darkness could forever conceal. Chapter 14. Holmes closes in. The final clue revealed the fog had lifted by the time we returned to Baker Street, though a chill lingered in the air as if the city itself were holding its breath. Holmes sat silently by the fire, his eyes fixed on the dancing flames, while I pored over the notes we had gathered, the witness statements, the letters, the mysterious fragments of fabric. The case, once a tangled skein, was drawing closer to its final knot, and Holmes seemed poised on the edge of revelation. "It is time, Watson," he said at last, his voice steady but charged with anticipation. "There remains but one question unanswered: the manner in which the locked room was secured, and the true means by which Eleanor Mordaunt met her end. He rose, moving toward the window as if seeking inspiration in the London streets below. The key to this enigma lies not in the grand gestures or dramatic clues, but in the minutiae, those overlooked details that escape notice until the final piece is found. Holmes retrieved from his pocket a small, silver tuning forks, the very instrument he had borrowed from the music room early in the investigation. He struck it lightly, the pure tone resonating in the quiet room. "Consider the harp," he murmured, "an instrument delicate and precise. If a weapon was used here, it would be subtle, silent, even to mask the crime as an accident or natural death." Turning to me, he produced a slender vial, its contents long since evaporated, but its faint scent still discernible. Prussic acid, a poison as swift as it is merciless, its telltale almond aroma the only warning. Holmes then produced a thin wire, almost invisible in the lamplight. "This," he said, "was fashioned into a mechanism, a trap designed to lock the music room door from within without the need for a key." He explained how the wire, affixed to the latch, could be manipulated through a narrow gap beneath the door or a loose panel in the floor, pulled taut to engage the lock remotely. An ingenious device, Watson, but one that required careful planning and knowledge of the room's precise layout. The fog hung heavy and restless over London, shrouding the city in a damp embrace that seemed to slow time itself. On that particular evening, as Holmes and I made our way back to Baker Street from Mordaunt House, the street lamps flickered like distant, wary sentinels, casting long, trembling shadows against the wet cobblestones. The atmosphere was thick with an unspoken tension, as if the city held its breath, awaiting some long-delayed reckoning. Holmes moved with the deliberate silence of a man already possessed by thought, his gaze occasionally catching mine, reflecting a gleam of that fierce resolve which I had learned to trust above all else. It was clear that the events of the past days had coalesced into something far greater than a mere crime of passion or chance. Something darker, more calculated, was at the heart of this haunting melody of death. Upon arrival at Baker Street, Holmes immediately set to work in the solitude of his study, surrounded by a clutter of papers, sketches, and notes amassed from our long inquiry. I watched as he ran his fingers through his hair and muttered under his breath, his mind unfolding and refolding the tangled web of clues with uncanny precision. After hours spent in near silence, he rose and turned to me, the weight of revelation settling upon his shoulders. "Watson, this case has been a symphony of shadows, each note crafted to conceal a terrible truth. We have but one final movement before the full score is revealed." He held in his hand a small, delicate object wrapped carefully in tissue, a slender silver tuning fork, the very one he had borrowed from the music room early in our investigation. The fork gleamed under the flickering gaslight as Holmes struck it lightly, producing a pure, haunting tone that seemed to hang in the air like a whispered secret. "The harp," he began quietly, "was not merely a prop in this tragedy, but an instrument of concealment. The last moments of Eleanor Mordaunt's life were as carefully composed as any melody. The slightest movement, the faintest sound, all orchestrated to veil the true nature of her death." Holmes' gaze hardened as he retrieved a small, empty vial from a drawer, the faint scent of almonds still clinging faintly to its rim. Prussic acid, the silent killer. A poison swift and merciless, its only warning the bitter fragrance of bitter almonds. He then revealed a slender, almost invisible wire, a piece of dark metal bent and twisted with the meticulous craftsmanship of a jeweler rather than a common murderer. This, he declared. He pulled from his coat a small scrap of fabric, folded carefully within the lining. I examined it closely, a delicate thread, embroidered with a pattern faintly reminiscent. "Where did you find this?" I asked. Holmes smiled faintly. "In the folds of Mrs. Hargreaves' apron this morning." The revelation gave me pause. The housekeeper, already burdened with grief and fear, had perhaps been closer to the unfolding tragedy than any of us suspected. Holmes' mind was already weaving the connections between the fabric, the stolen letters, and the elusive voice that had haunted the household. "Consider, Watson," Holmes continued, "the singing that called the Colonel's name. It was no ghostly lament, nor a simple accident. It was a carefully crafted signal, a message encoded in music and voice, designed to lure, to confuse, and to conceal." He unfolded a sheet of music, pointing to the repetitive motif. This melody, the calling song, was the key. But the true message lay not in the notes themselves, but in their delivery, the pauses, the emphasis, the very timbre of the voice. It was a code, one known only to those bound by shared history and secrets. I was struck by the elegance of the deduction, yet I sensed Holmes was holding back the full extent of his realization. "Is the code broken, then?" I pressed. Holmes nodded slowly. "Yes, but only just. The missing letters, the staged, locked room, the attempts to silence witnesses, all were part of a grand design to keep this secret buried. Yet it was the smallest thread, this fragment of embroidered cloth, that unraveled it." He paused. "Mrs. Hargreaves, for all her loyalty, carries a burden of guilt. Her silence was purchased with threats, and her hands tremble not from grief alone." As the pieces fell into place, Holmes turned to me with a look both somber and resolute. "Soon, Watson, the full truth will emerge, not merely of a murder, but of a life destroyed by secrets and lies." The voice that sang Eleanor's name was a call for justice, long delayed but not denied. The weight of his words settled between us, a quiet promise that the mystery's heart was close at hand, and that the final revelation, when it came, would resonate far beyond the walls of Mordaunt House. Chapter 13. The final attempt to escape. Days that followed the unraveling of secrets at Mordaunt House were marked by a palpable tension that hung over the household like a gathering storm. Holmes and I returned frequently, our visits punctuated by moments of stillness and sudden insight, yet always shadowed by the knowledge that the true culprit remained at large. Their desperation mounting one evening, as the sun dipped behind the gray clouds and the house settled into the uneasy calm before night, an urgent summons drew us back to Lambeth. The housekeeper met us at the door, her face pale and drawn. "It's Mr. Lee, sir," she said breathlessly. "He's missing. His room found in disarray, and the back gate wide open." Holmes' eyes narrowed. An attempt to flee, or a trap laid for him. We searched the house swiftly, but found no sign of the young man. The garden gate's lock showed no signs of forced entry, but the latch was bent, as though hurriedly manipulated. The narrow path beyond was disturbed footprints leading into the fog. lost to the shadows of the night as dawn broke. A messenger arrived with news from a nearby inn, a stranger matching Lee's description had been seen boarding a coach bound for the northern counties. Holmes wasted no time in organizing a pursuit, and I accompanied him, the urgency of the chase pressing upon us like a living thing. Along the winding roads and through rain-slicked villages, we pressed onward, chasing shadows and half-formed clues. Holmes' mind, ever restless, pieced together fragments of whispered conversations, discarded letters, and a growing web of deceit. When we finally caught up to the coach at a lonely roadside inn, Lee was nowhere to be found. The innkeeper mentioned a hurried departure in the early hours, a man asking for a post to the next town. The driver spoke of a passenger, nervous and glancing frequently over his shoulder. Holmes turned to me, his voice low and sharp. Our quarry is running, not from the law, but from the past he cannot escape. We returned to London with heavy hearts, the weight of the case pressing ever tighter. Yet, even as the search continued, Holmes remained certain the fugitive's flight was the final, desperate act of a man cornered, his options dwindling. Back at Mordaunt House, the remaining household braced for the coming reckoning. Holmes, meanwhile, prepared for the confrontation that would bring the tangled threads of deceit to a final, inevitable conclusion. "Soon, Watson," he said quietly, "we shall see who answers the last call." The voice that sang Eleanor's name, once a haunting echo, now rang clear as a summons, not just for justice, but for the truth that no darkness could forever conceal. Chapter 14. Holmes closes in. The final clue revealed the fog had lifted by the time we returned to Baker Street, though a chill lingered in the air as if the city itself were holding its breath. Holmes sat silently by the fire, his eyes fixed on the dancing flames, while I pored over the notes we had gathered, the witness statements, the letters, the mysterious fragments of fabric. The case, once a tangled skein, was drawing closer to its final knot, and Holmes seemed poised on the edge of revelation. "It is time, Watson," he said at last, his voice steady but charged with anticipation. "There remains but one question unanswered: the manner in which the locked room was secured, and the true means by which Eleanor Mordaunt met her end." He rose, moving toward the window, as if seeking inspiration in the London streets below. "The key to this enigma lies not in the grand gestures or dramatic clues, but in the minutiae, those overlooked details that escape notice until the final piece is found." Holmes retrieved from his pocket a small, silver tuning forks, the very instrument he had borrowed from the music room early in the investigation. He struck it lightly, the pure tone resonating in the quiet room. "Consider the harp," he murmured, "an instrument delicate and precise. If a weapon was used here, it would be subtle, silent, even to mask the crime as an accident or natural death." Turning to me, he produced a slender vial, its contents long since evaporated, but its faint scent still discernible. Prussic acid, a poison as swift as it is merciless, its telltale almond aroma the only warning. Holmes then produced a thin wire, almost invisible in the lamplight. "This," he said, "was fashioned into a mechanism, a trap designed to lock the music room door from within without the need for a key." He explained how the wire, affixed to the latch, could be manipulated through a narrow gap beneath the door or a loose panel in the floor, pulled taut to engage the lock remotely, An ingenious device, Watson, but one that required careful planning and knowledge of the room's precise layout. The fog hung heavy and restless over London, shrouding the city in a damp embrace that seemed to slow time itself. On that particular evening, as Holmes and I made our way back to Baker Street from Mordaunt House, the street lamps flickered like distant, wary sentinels, casting long, trembling shadows against the wet cobblestones. The atmosphere was thick with an unspoken tension, as if the city held its breath, awaiting some long-delayed reckoning. Holmes moved with the deliberate silence of a man already possessed by thought, his gaze occasionally catching mine, reflecting a gleam of that fierce resolve which I had learned to trust above all else. It was clear that the events of the past days had coalesced into something far greater than a mere crime of passion or chance. Something darker, more calculated, was at the heart of this haunting melody of death. Upon arrival at Baker Street, Holmes immediately set to work in the solitude of his study, surrounded by a clutter of papers, sketches, and notes amassed from our long inquiry. I watched as he ran his fingers through his hair and muttered under his breath, his mind unfolding and refolding the tangled web of clues with uncanny precision. After hours spent in near silence, he rose and turned to me, the weight of revelation settling upon his shoulders. Watson, this case has been a symphony of shadows, each note crafted to conceal a terrible truth. We have but one final movement before the full score is revealed. He held in his hand a small, delicate object wrapped carefully in tissue, a slender silver tuning fork, the very one he had borrowed from the music room early in our investigation. The fork gleamed under the flickering gaslight as Holmes struck it lightly, producing a pure, haunting tone that seemed to hang in the air like a whispered secret. The harp, he began quietly, was not merely a prop in this tragedy, but an instrument of concealment. The last moments of Eleanor Mordaunt's life were as carefully composed as any melody. The slightest movement, the faintest sound, all orchestrated to veil the true nature of her death. Holmes' gaze hardened as he retrieved a small, empty vial from a drawer, the faint scent of almonds still clinging faintly to its rim. Prussic acid, the silent killer. A poison swift and merciless, its only warning the bitter fragrance of bitter almonds. He then revealed a slender, almost invisible wire, a piece of dark metal bent and twisted with the meticulous craftsmanship of a jeweler rather than a common murderer. This, he declared, was the key to the locked-room mystery, a device fashioned to manipulate the door latch remotely, allowing the killer to lock the music room from outside without leaving a trace. I listened, entranced, as Holmes recounted the final night. The harp had been moved, not randomly, but deliberately, its legs placed just so to conceal the wire's anchor point. The armchair, angled away from the fire and toward the window, masked the slight disturbances on the carpet below. The open music cabinet concealed gaps in the sheet music that were clues rather than chaos. And the voice? I asked softly, recalling the servant's fearful testimony. Holmes' lips curved in a faint smile tinged with sadness. The voice that sang Henry. Henry was no ghost, Watson. It was a signal, a code embedded in a melody known only to those bound by shared history and pain. It was both a cry for help and a final farewell, carefully rehearsed to confuse and mislead. as he spoke. I realized how deeply the case was entwined with memory, music, and human frailty, a haunting requiem played out not just with notes and words, but with hearts broken long before the fatal act. Holmes hand traced the intricate details of the wire mechanism, explaining how the killer must have tested. The subtle scratches on the window frame betrayed a hurried effort to alter the crime scene, and the glass with traces of poison was placed within easy reach to misdirect suspicion. Every detail was calculated, Holmes said quietly, to buy time, to shift blame, to obscure the truth beneath layers of artifice. The planted sheet music in Briggs' quarters was the perfect red herring, a trap set for the unwary. He turned suddenly, his eyes blazing with the fire of discovery. But there is one last piece, Watson, one clue so subtle it might easily have been missed. From his pocket, Holmes withdrew a thin sliver of fabric, dark with age, and embroidered with a delicate pattern that matched the filigree carved into the harp's frame. Found this morning, hidden within the folds of Mrs. Hargreaves' apron, a fragment of a secret past sewn into the present. The room seemed to close in around me as the significance settled. The housekeeper, loyal but terrified, bore secrets deeper than mere service. Her trembling hands and careful silences were the final echoes of a truth long suppressed. Suddenly, a sharp knock interrupted our reverie. Lestrade entered, his expression a mixture of relief and urgency. "Mr. Holmes, we have located Mr. Lee." Holmes nodded, already moving toward the door, his cloak swirling behind him like a shadow. "Then it is time, Watson, to close the circle." The full truth was no longer distant. The lock, the poison, the coded song, all pointed to the mind of a man driven by fear, love, and desperation. And as Holmes prepared to confront the final actor in this tragic play, I felt the familiar surge of anticipation mingled with the somber knowledge that for all our reason and insight, some mysteries carried the weight of sorrow too profound for words. We stepped out into the foggy night, the streets silent but for the echo of footsteps, a steady cadence that marked the march toward justice. The voice that had sung Eleanor's name was no longer a haunting echo, but a clarion call, summoning the truth from the shadows. And with Holmes beside me, I knew that no darkness, no matter how carefully wrought, could withstand the piercing light of his intellect and resolve. The realization dawned fully as Holmes recounted the night of the murder. The harp moved slightly to conceal the wire's anchoring point. The chair angled away to mask any disturbance, and the staged singing served as a final ruse to confuse and delay the discovery. But the final touch, Holmes said softly, was the attempt to implicate Briggs through the planted sheet music, diverting suspicion and buying the murderer time to escape or strike again. As the weight of the deduction settled over us, a knock at the door announced the arrival of Lestrade, breathless with news. "Mr. Holmes, we have located Mr. Lee." Holmes nodded, already rising. "Then the time has come to close the circle." The last clue had revealed not only the means, but the mind behind the crimen act of cold calculation veiled beneath layers of music, memory, and misdirection. And with it, Holmes prepared to bring the mystery to its long-awaited conclusion. Chapter 15: The Final Gathering. Drawing room at Mordaunt House was heavy with anticipation as Holmes convened the household one last time. The late afternoon light filtered dimly through the tall windows, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch across the faces of those assembled. The atmosphere was taut in unspoken understanding, hung in the air that the moment of reckoning had come. Colonel Mordaunt sat rigidly in his usual place, his gaze fixed on some distant point, as if bracing himself against a tide yet to break. Mrs. Hargreaves stood near the fireplace, her hands clenched, eyes flickering with a mixture of fear and resolve. Martha, the nursemaid, though pale and trembling, was present, her presence a silent testament to her courage. And at the far end of the room stood Mr. Adrian Lee, his dark eyes guarded, yet betraying the tension beneath his calm exterior. Holmes paced slowly before the group, his long fingers steepled beneath his chin. His voice was measured, deliberate, each word chosen to build the intricate web that would soon collapse. We have come far in unraveling the threads of a story that began long before any of us could imagine. Tonight, I shall reveal what lies beneath the surface, the truth that has been concealed by music, silence, and shadows. He began by recounting the history between Eleanor Mordaunt and Gerald Crane, painting a picture of passion turned sour, promises broken, and secrets fiercely guarded. The letters found in the garden shed, the hidden melody known only to a few, and the carefully staged deception were laid bare for all to hear. Holmes then turned his attention to the household, his gaze settling on each face in turn. The locked room was no barrier but a stage, a carefully constructed illusion designed to mislead. The poison administered, the attempts to frame others, and the subsequent acts of desperation all point to one conclusion. The room fell into a tense silence as Holmes prepared to name the culprit. Mr. Lee, your presence here was not merely as a cousin or visitor, but as the architect of this tragic tale. Your past with Eleanor and your fear of exposure drove you to acts most foul. Lee's composure faltered, his eyes darting to the door as if seeking escape. You have no proof, he exclaimed, voice shaking. Holmes' smile was thin but unyielding. Proof lies in the evidence you sought to destroy: the letters, the embroidered cloth, the wire mechanism, each a piece of a puzzle that only you could assemble. With a sigh, Lee sank into a chair, the weight of guilt finally breaking his defiance. It was never meant to go so far, he whispered. I only wanted to protect her from Crane, from the past. But in doing so, Holmes said softly, you became the very shadow you feared. The voice that sang her name was both a call for help and a requiem for what was lost. As the household absorbed the revelation, the first faint sounds of evening bells echoed through the streets, marking the close of one chapter and the beginning of another. Justice, long delayed, was at last within reach. Holmes turned to me, his expression tempered with the quiet satisfaction of a case resolved. Tomorrow, Watson, we shall see that justice is not only served, but understood. The evening air was thick with the scent of impending rain, the sky a roiling mass of charcoal clouds that seemed to press down upon the streets of London, like a weight from which there was no escape. Mordaunt House stood in solemn silence, its tall windows darkened and its once lively halls now echoing with the soft footfalls of those summoned for a meeting that promised to unravel all that had been hidden in shadow. Within the grand drawing room, the flickering glow of candlelight cast long, dancing silhouettes across the heavy tapestries and the polished woodwork. The atmosphere was taut, the kind of silence that thrums beneath the surface before a storm breaks. Faces were drawn tight with anxiety, eyes flickering with uncertainty and dread. The household had gathered at Holmes' insistence, though no one could say exactly what awaited them. Colonel Mordaunt sat stiffly in his usual chair, his hands clenched so tightly that the knuckles shone white. His eyes, dark and hollowed by sleepless nights, gazed into the fire without really seeing it, as though trying to hold at bay the relentless tide of grief and fear. Beside him stood Mrs. Hargreaves, the housekeeper, her posture rigid, lips pressed in a thin line that betrayed a steely resolve beneath the trembling surface. Martha, the nursemaid, looked fragile and pale, but her eyes held a quiet strength, unspoken vow to see the truth come to light at the far side of the room. Adrian Lee remained apart, his dark gaze fixed downward, as though weighing some unbearable burden. The strained politeness that had once veiled his presence had now fallen away, revealing the raw tension of a man who knew his fate hung in the balance. Holmes stood before them, a figure of calm amidst the gathering storm. His tall form was framed by the dancing candlelight, his face set in the stern mask of justice, as he prepared to reveal the hidden threads of this tangled tale. His eyes, sharp and piercing, scanned the assembled group, holding them in a silent command that brooked no interruption. "My friends," Holmes began, his voice steady and deliberate, "we have walked a long path together, one marked by secrets, lies, and shadows that have stretched across years. Tonight the veil is lifted. The truth, long concealed beneath layers of music and memory, shall now be made manifest." He spoke slowly, weaving a narrative that was both clear and haunting. Holmes recounted the early days of Eleanor Mordaunt and Gerald Crane, their youthful passion, the promises made and broken, and the grudges borne in silence. He detailed the return of Crane, his threatening letters, and the desperate measures taken by those who loved Eleanor to protect her from a past they wished to forget. The room was silent, save for the faint crackling of the fire as Holmes spoke of the locked music. Room the stage upon which the final fatal act had been played. He described the cunning device, the thin wire that had locked the door remotely, the poisoned glass, and the planted sheet music intended to cast suspicion upon the loyal butler Holmes. Words cut through the tension like a blade. All these elements point to one conclusion. The architect of this tragedy was none other than Mr. Adrian Lee. The name hung heavy in the air, and Lee's eyes shot up, burning with a mixture of anger and fear. "You have no proof," he cried, his voice shaking with desperation. Holmes did not flinch. "Proof lies not only in evidence. You tried to destroy the letters hidden beneath the floor, the embroidered cloth found in Mrs. Hargreaves' possession, and the ingenious wire mechanism. But more telling still are the motives etched in your every word and deed, the jealousy, the fear, and the desperate desire to control a fate long beyond your grasp." Lee sank into a chair, his defiance shattered by the weight of truth. "I only wished to protect her," he whispered, "from Crane, from the past that would have destroyed her." Holmes' expression softened, though the steel in his voice remained. "In seeking to shield Eleanor, you became the very darkness that consumed her. The voice that sang her name was both a lament and a call for justice. As the revelations settled, the household seemed to exhale, the air shifting from heavy dread to a cautious hope. Yet beneath the surface, I could sense the deep sorrow that lingered, the knowledge that no verdict could truly heal the wounds left behind. Holmes turned to me quietly. "Tomorrow, Watson, we shall see justice served. But tonight, we bear witness to the fragile balance between truth and mercy." Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it the fading echoes of a melody that had once been a song of love, now a requiem for a life lost to secrets and lies. Chapter 16. The Reveal. Holmes breaks down the crime. The atmosphere in the drawing room was thick with anticipation as Holmes prepared to deliver his message. The assembled household sat in taut silence, the weight of unspoken fears pressing upon each of them. Holmes' eyes, sharp and unyielding, surveyed the room with the quiet authority of a man who has seen the very heart of darkness and emerged with the truth clutched in his hand. "My friends," Holmes began, his voice calm yet carrying an unmistakable gravity, "the case of Eleanor Mordaunt's death is one of intricate design, woven with threads of passion, fear, and deception. It is time to unravel the tapestry, to lay bare the sequence of events that led to this tragic end." He traced the beginnings to the youthful days of Eleanor and Gerald Crane, whose passionate but ill-fated courtship left scars deeper than time might heal. Crane's return, marked by the threatening letters and desperate demands, stirred a fear in Eleanor that set the stage for the fatal encounter. Holmes detailed the plan concocted by Adrian Lee, whose proximity and knowledge made him both an ally and a shadowed adversary. Lee's motivations, complex and fraught, were born of a twisted desire to protect Eleanor, even as his actions wrought destruction. The locked music room, Holmes explained, was the stage upon which the final act played out. The wire mechanism was ingenious, a silent key that locked the door from within, creating the illusion of impossibility. The poisoned glass, the staged singing, and the planted sheet music were all devices intended to mislead and distract. Holmes paused, letting the weight of his words settle. The voice that sang Henry, Henry was not a ghostly echo, but a desperate cry-code between Eleanor and her past. The nursemaid's testimony, the movement of the harp, the misplaced keyzal pieces in this carefully arranged puzzle. Turning to Lee, Holmes continued, "You attempted to silence witnesses, to burn evidence, and ultimately to flee. Your guilt was sealed by the very desperation you displayed." Lee, visibly shaken, made no attempt to deny the charges. The room held its breath as the full truth was laid bare, the complex dance of human frailty and cunning revealed in stark relief. Holmes concluded, "Justice, in its truest form, is the illumination of truth. It is not merely punishment, but understanding, the reckoning of motives, the unveiling of secrets, and the hope that from darkness may come some measure of light." As the household absorbed the revelation, I felt the familiar mixture of awe and melancholy that always accompanied Holmes' conclusions. The case was solved, but the human cost lingered, like a fading melody, haunting, beautiful, and eternally mournful. The drawing room at Mordaunt House was suffused with a heavy silence that pressed upon the assembled guests like the weight of a gathering storm. Each face bore its own shadow, some etched with fear, others with suspicion. and yet all bound by the fragile thread of hope that at last the mystery would be unraveled. Holmes stood at the center, his figure tall and commanding, eyes alight with that unyielding fire which always foretold the unveiling of hidden truths. "My friends," he began, his voice clear and unwavering, "we have traveled far along a path darkened by secrets, deceit, and sorrow. Tonight I shall recount to you the true story behind the death of Eleanor Mordaunt, tale not merely of murder, but of passion, desperation, and a past that refused to remain buried." Holmes traced the contours of the past with deft precision, drawing the thread back to Eleanor's youth and the tempestuous courtship with Gerald Crane. He painted a vivid picture of love turned to bitterness, of promises broken and resentments festering in the shadows of time. The letters found hidden beneath the garden shed were not mere relics, but vivid testaments to threats whispered and fears concealed. He turned slowly to Adrian Lee, whose gaze now faltered under the weight of the narrative. "Mr. Lee, your closeness to Mrs. Mordaunt was no accident, nor was your presence in this household merely that of a relative. Your knowledge of her secrets and your fears of exposure compelled you to act with a coldness that now condemns you." The room held its breath as Holmes laid bare the intricacies of the locked-room mystery. The wire mechanism, nearly invisible to the untrained eye, had been the key allowing the murderer to secure the music room from outside, creating the illusion of impossibility. The poisoned glass, the carefully planted sheet music intended to frame the loyal butler, the staged singing, all these were threads woven into a tapestry of deception. Holmes paused, letting the gravity of his words settle before continuing. The voice heard calling Henry. Henry was not a spectral echo, but a coded plea message, known only to those bound by love and fear. The nursemaid's testimony, the disturbed harp, the misplaced keys all form part of a symphony that played out on the night of the murder. Turning once more to Lee, Holmes' gaze was unwavering. "You sought to silence witnesses, to destroy evidence, and to flee when cornered, but your desperation betrayed you. The smallest details, the fragment of embroidered cloth, the scent of almonds, the subtle scratches upon the window frame have all spoken your guilt." Lee's composure crumbled as the truth was laid bare. "I did it to protect her," he whispered, voice breaking. "From Crane, from the past that haunted us both. I never wished for this to end in death." Holmes' expression softened slightly, but his tone remained firm. "In protecting her, you sealed her fate." The voice that sang her name was both a cry for help and a requiem for a love lost. As the household absorbed the revelation, a solemn hush fell. The tangled web of love, betrayal, and desperation had been laid bare, and justice, in its complex form, had found its mark. I sat beside Holmes afterward, the flickering candlelight casting shadows across his thoughtful face. "How do you bear the weight of such truths, Holmes?" I asked quietly. He smiled, a fleeting gesture touched with melancholy. "Watson, the burden of truth is heavy, but it is a burden we must bear. For, in revealing the darkness, we allow the light to shine, however faintly, into the deepest corners of the human soul." And so the case of the voice that sang her name reached its crescendo with triumph, but with the quiet acknowledgment of the fragility and complexity of justice, love, and the human heart. Chapter 17. Outcome and Justice. The arrest of Adrian Lee marked the beginning of the final chapter in this mournful saga. As he was led away in the quiet of dawn, the household seemed to exhale collectively, the heavy shroud of suspicion and fear lifting with hesitant relief. Yet beneath that relief lay a complex weave of sorrow, regret, and unresolved questions, a reminder that justice, while necessary, often came at a cost beyond measure. Colonel Mordaunt, though outwardly composed, carried the weight of loss with stoic dignity. He confided to me in one of our few private moments that Eleanor's memory was both a comfort and a tormentum melody that played ceaselessly in the corridors of his heart. Mrs. Hargreaves, whose silence had concealed more than she could bear, found some solace in the truth. Though the burden of her complicity left scars unseen, Martha, the nursemaid, returned safely from her disappearance, her courage and loyalty shining through the ordeal. Her testimony had been crucial in illuminating the final pieces of the puzzle, and her presence brought a fragile warmth to the otherwise somber house. As for Holmes, his satisfaction was tempered by the recognition that the layers of human frailty he had uncovered were not so easily mended by legal verdicts. The law, he remarked one evening, is a stern guardian, but it cannot always heal the wounds born in silence. At Scotland Yard, Lestrade took credit for the resolution in the public eye. Yet I knew well that it was Holmes' relentless intellect and unwavering resolve that had truly brought the matter to a close. In the quiet of our rooms, Holmes was content to let the world believe as it might, focused instead on the next enigma awaiting his attention. The voice that had sung Eleanor's name, a haunting refrain of love and loss, now lay silent, its mystery laid bare. Yet I could not help but feel that its echo would linger in the hearts of those who had heard it, a reminder of lives touched irrevocably by secrets, sorrow, and the inexorable pursuit of truth. As the weeks passed and the city resumed its ceaseless rhythm, I penned the account of this singular case, ever mindful of the delicate balance between justice and mercy, between the visible and the hidden, and, as always, I found in Holmes a companion whose mind illuminated the darkest corners of human nature with the steady light of reason and compassion. The first pale light of dawn crept over London as Adrian Lee was escorted from Mordaunt House in the firm custody of Scotland Yard. The city, oblivious to the small dramas played out within its walls, continued its relentless pulse. The distant clatter of carts and the muffled voices of early risers marking the start of a new day. Yet within the walls of the grand house on Lambeth Street, a quiet reckoning unfolded, a mingling of relief, sorrow, and the unspoken understanding that justice, while served, could never restore what was lost. Colonel Mordaunt, stoic as ever, bore the burden of his wife's absence with a dignity forged in the crucible of grief. His eyes, once sharp and commanding, now held a distant sadness, a look that spoke of memories forever etched in the spaces Eleanor once filled. In moments of solitude, he confided to me that her presence lingered like a haunting melody, both comforting and agonizing, a refrain that refused to fade. Mrs. Hargreaves, the housekeeper, who had long carried secrets too heavy for words, found a fragile solace in the truth's revelation. Yet beneath her composed exterior, I sensed a deep and lingering guilt, a recognition that silence had been her shield, and truth her reluctant burden. returned from her ordeal with a quiet bravery that belied her years. Her testimony had been a beacon in the tangled darkness of this mystery, and her presence now brought a tentative lightness to the somber household. In her eyes, I saw the spark of resilience, a testament to the strength of the human spirit, even amid despair. Holmes, ever the enigma, regarded the unfolding justice with a measured calm. "The law," he remarked one evening as we stood by the fire, "is an imperfect instrument. It metes out punishment, but it cannot heal the wounds etched deep within the human heart. Our task is to illuminate the truth and leave the rest to fate." At Scotland Yard, Inspector Lestrade took the credit he was eager for, presenting the resolution to the public with a flourish. Yet, in the quiet corners of the city, those who knew the true course of the investigation whispered of Holmes' unparalleled intellect and steadfast resolve, the light that had cut through the fog of deceit, the voice that once sang Eleanor's name, a haunting echo that had stirred the household from its depths, now lay silent, but its resonance remained, a poignant reminder of love and loss, of secrets spoken in whispers and silences alike. Weeks passed, and the city settled back into its ceaseless rhythm, the case becoming one among many in the ledger of justice. Yet in the pages I penned, I sought to capture not only the facts, but the fragile humanity woven through the tale, the sorrow, the courage, and the relentless pursuit of truth. Holmes, as always, was ready to turn his gaze toward the next mystery, his mind a restless flame seeking new shadows to illuminate. And as I watched him, I was reminded that while justice may be served in the courts, it is in the quiet moments between the notes of life's melody that true understanding is found. The voice that sang Eleanor's name had finally been answered, not with silence, but with the enduring light of reason, compassion, and the unyielding search for truth. Chapter 18. Holmes' final reflection. The case of the voice that sang her name had drawn to its inevitable close. And yet, as Holmes and I settled once more into the quiet sanctuary of Baker Street, I found the usual fervor of his mind tempered by a rare stillness. The evening fire flickered softly, casting a warm glow upon the familiar clutter of the room, while outside, the distant rumble of the city's ceaseless life persisted unheeding. Holmes reclined in his chair, eyes half closed but alert, fingers steepled in the fashion that invariably accompanied his deepest thoughts. "Watson," he began, his voice low and reflective. This case was a melody played in minor key composition of grief and deception, of past sins reverberating through present tragedy. He paused, as though weighing the enormity of the human frailty revealed by our investigation. The cunning of Adrian Lee lay not merely in the mechanics of murder, but in the intricate weaving of fear, loyalty, and desperation. It is a stark reminder that the greatest mysteries often dwell not in riddles or locked rooms, but in the shadows of the human heart. I nodded, struck by the profound gravity in his tone. "And yet," I ventured, "you made it seem almost elementary." Holmes smiled faintly, the expression a blend of irony and humility. "Elementary, my dear Watson, only in the sense that once the pieces fall into place, the truth is simple. The difficulty lies in discerning which pieces belong, and which have been artfully placed to mislead." He stretched and glanced toward the window, where the first stars began to pierce the night. Cases such as these remind us that justice is not always swift or merciful. It is a slow and careful illumination unmasking of the tangled webs we weave. Rising, Holmes moved to his desk and picked up his violin, drawing the bow gently across the strings. The room filled with a soft, haunting melody, the same melancholy strain that had haunted Eleanor Mordaunt's final days. As the notes drifted, I felt the echo of the voice that had sung a name long after the singer had passed, a testament to love, loss, and the enduring quest for truth. After a long moment, Holmes set aside his violin and turned to me. "Now, Watson, we must look forward. For every mystery solved, there are countless others waiting in the shadows, and it is our calling to bring them into the light." As I sat in thoughtful silence, I realized once more the profound privilege it was to walk beside such a Minda beacon in the fog of human nature. The voice that had sung Eleanor's name was now silent, its secrets laid bare, but the song of justice, reason, and compassion would continue to play on, unwavering and eternal. The minutes stretched into what felt like hours as we remained concealed behind the curtains. Every small sound, the rustle of leaves, the distant footsteps on the gravel, the faint creak of the garden gates, seemed magnified in the stillness. Holmes's eyes never left the doorway, his posture taut as a coiled spring, every muscle primed for the inevitable revelation. Martha's silhouette moved with quiet determination, her face pale but resolute as she crossed the threshold into the music room. I could see the flicker of fear in her eyes, but also a fierce courage born of necessity. Behind her, the shadow of Gerald Crane loomed, his every motion weighted with a mixture of hesitation and resolve. The man was caught in a liminal space, part predator, part desperate lover, his presence both a threat and a confession. Their whispered conversation unfolded like a dark sonnet, a litany of regret, accusation, and pleading. Martha's voice trembled as she implored Crane to abandon his vengeful pursuit, to leave behind the ghosts that haunted their shared past. Crane's replies were harsh, tinged with bitterness and a raw, desperate need for reconciliation that twisted quickly into menace. Suddenly, Crane's hand moved with sinister intent, producing the small vial that had become the silent symbol of death in this tragic tale. The glint of glass caught the candlelight, and a cold shiver ran down my spine. Before he could act, Martha lunged, shattering the vial against the wooden floor. The faint scent of bitter almonds drifted through the room, a spectral reminder of the poison that might have claimed another life. Holmes's voice cut through the tension like a blade. Enough. His presence filled the room, commanding and absolute. Crane's shoulders sagged, the fight draining from him as the weight of exposure settled like a shroud as the candle flames flickered, casting dancing shadows upon the walls. The full gravity of the moment unfolded before us. This was no mere confrontation of suspects, but the meeting of fractured souls haunted by love, betrayal, and the inexorable pull of truth. Holmes turned to me, his eyes reflecting the flickering light with a fierce clarity. "The trap has been sprung, Watson, and with it, the final act of this sorrowful drama begins." I sat back, breath held, as the room seemed to hold its breath too, waiting for the inevitable unraveling, for the voice that sang Eleanor's name to find its final, haunting refrain.